The beam was falling. Clara's scream tore through the howling blizzard as timber groaned and splintered above Caleb's head. In that split second, snow blinding, wind roaring, death descending, he understood with perfect clarity that the stranger he'd mail-ordered 6 months ago was about to die trying to save him. This wasn't the bargain he'd made. This wasn't supposed to be love. But here they were, tied together by rope and desperation, in a storm that wanted them both dead. If you want to know how a man who wanted nothing but quiet companionship ended up staring down death with a woman who refused to be quiet about anything, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had worn thin, threatening to tear the paper into useless fragments. Caleb Ward sat at his kitchen table, if you could call it that, really just planks hammered together and sanded smooth enough not to give splinters, and read the words for what must have been the 100th time since it arrived 3 weeks ago. Dear Mr. Ward, I am writing in response to your advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette. I am 26 years of age, in good health, and accustomed to hard work. I can cook, sew, keep accounts, and am not afraid of frontier life. I have no family remaining and no attachments that would prevent immediate departure. I do not write flowery words or make promises about affection I cannot guarantee. What I can promise is this: I will work beside you, honor the agreement we make, and not burden you with complaints or weakness. If these terms are acceptable, send word and I will arrive on the next available stage. Respectfully, Clara Whitfield. The words were practical, blunt even. No poetry about love or destiny or any of the romantic nonsense that made Caleb's skin crawl. That's what had sold him on Clara Whitfield, whoever she was. A woman who understood that marriage on the Montana frontier in 1885 wasn't about passion, it was about survival. Caleb pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the land that owned him more than he'd ever owned it. 300 acres of stubborn earth, a ranch house that leaked when it rained, a barn that needed replacing, and cattle that seemed determined to die in new and creative ways each season. He was 32 years old and felt 50. The work was killing him slowly, but the loneliness was worse. Last winter, he'd gone 4 months without hearing another human voice except his own. He'd started talking to the horses just to remember what conversation felt like. By February, he'd caught himself setting 2 plates at dinner out of sheer habit, forgetting for just a moment that no one was coming to fill that second chair. That's when he'd written the advertisement. Not because he wanted a wife, he'd stopped wanting things years ago, but because he needed one. Someone to share the load, someone to break the silence, someone to make the ranch feel less like a beautiful prison. He'd been honest in his ad, at least. Rancher, Montana Territory. Seeking practical woman for partnership in marriage. Must be willing to work. Affection not required. Respond with references. 17 women had written back. Most of them had included carefully posed photographs, studio portraits with soft lighting and hopeful smiles. They'd written about their accomplishments, their domestic skills, their dreams of building a loving home on the frontier. Caleb had eliminated all of them. Only Clara's letter had felt real. Only Clara had said the quiet part out loud. This wasn't about love. This was a transaction, a mutual agreement between 2 people who needed something from each other and were honest enough to admit it. So he'd written back, "Yes, come." And now, staring at the autumn sky turning gray with the promise of early snow, Caleb felt the first stirrings of doubt. What if she was hideous? What if she was cruel? What if she arrived and took one look at his failing ranch and got right back on that stagecoach? What if he just made the biggest mistake of his life? Too late now, he muttered to himself, reaching for his coat. The stage was due in 2 hours, and he had work to finish before he could ride into town to collect his mail-order bride. The town of Beaver Creek wasn't much to look at. A single muddy street lined with weathered buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of too many hard winters. Population fluctuated between 80 and 100 depending on the season and how many prospectors had frozen to death in the mountains. It had a general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a stage depot that served as the town's only connection to the civilized world beyond the territory. Caleb tied his horse outside the depot and stepped onto the warped wooden sidewalk, nodding to the few people he recognized. Margaret Hutchins, the postmaster's wife, gave him a look that was half curiosity, half pity. Word had spread fast about Caleb Ward's mail-order bride. In a town this small, privacy was a luxury no one could afford. "She coming in today, Caleb?" Margaret called out, not bothering to hide her interest. "Should be." "Well, I hope she's got a strong constitution. Winter's coming early this year." Margaret's tone suggested she thought any woman desperate enough to answer a mail-order advertisement probably didn't have much in the way of options. Caleb didn't answer. He stepped into the depot, where station agent Hank Morrison was sorting mail behind a counter that had been carved with so many initials it looked like a wooden patchwork quilt. "Ward." Hank looked up, his weathered face creasing into something that might have been a smile. "Stage is running about 20 minutes late. Weather's slowing them down." "Fine. Heard you're expecting someone." "I am." Hank waited for more information, but Caleb had never been a talker, and he wasn't about to start now. After a long pause, Hank shrugged and went back to his mail sorting. "Well, I hope she's worth the wait." Caleb moved to the window and watched the gray sky. Worth the wait. What did that even mean? He wasn't expecting worth. He was expecting functional. Someone who could cook without burning the house down, who could handle a rifle if wolves came around, who wouldn't dissolve into hysterics when the winter storms hit and they were snowed in for weeks at a time. He tried to picture Clara Whitfield, 26, good health, accustomed to hard work, but his imagination failed him. Would she be tall or short, dark or fair? Would she speak softly or carry herself with confidence? Would she look at him with fear or relief or resignation? Would she regret this the moment she laid eyes on him? Caleb caught his reflection in the depot window. He wasn't a handsome man. Too much sun had weathered his face, too much work had hardened his hands, and too much solitude had made him forget how to smile properly. He looked exactly like what he was, a man the frontier had worn down to the essential parts. The sound of horses and wheels on frozen mud pulled him from his thoughts. The stagecoach was arriving. Hank moved to the door and Caleb followed, his heart doing something uncomfortable in his chest. This was it. The moment that would define the next however many years of his life. A woman he'd never met, never seen, was about to step off that stage and become his wife. The coach pulled to a stop in a spray of mud and melting ice. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd been running this route for 15 years, climbed down and opened the passenger door with a theatrical flourish. "Beaver Creek! Last stop before the end of the world." A man in a business suit emerged first, looking around with obvious distaste. Then an elderly woman carrying a carpet bag. And then, Caleb's breath stopped. The woman who stepped down from the stagecoach was nothing like what he'd imagined. She was tall, nearly as tall as Caleb himself, with dark hair pinned back in a practical bun that had come slightly loose during the journey. Her dress was plain gray wool, travel-worn but clean, and she carried a single trunk that she set down with the confidence of someone used to handling her own luggage. But it was her face that struck him. Not beautiful, exactly. Her features were too strong for that. Her jaw too defined, her nose too prominent. But compelling, intelligent. Her dark eyes scanned the street with sharp assessment, taking in the mud, the shabby buildings, the gray sky promising snow. She looked directly at Caleb, and he felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. "Mr. Ward?" Her voice was lower than he'd expected, clear, direct. "Yes." His own voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Clara Whitfield?" "I am." She didn't smile, didn't curtsy, didn't do any of the things a woman was supposed to do when meeting her future husband. She just stood there, waiting. The moment stretched out, awkward and uncertain. People were watching now. Margaret Hutchins had come out of the post office and several men had emerged from the saloon, drawn by the spectacle of Caleb Ward's mail-order bride. "You have more luggage?" Caleb finally asked. "Just the trunk." He moved to pick it up and was surprised by its weight. Whatever Clara Whitfield had brought with her, she'd packed her entire life into this one piece of luggage. He secured it to his horse while Clara stood silently, her hands folded in front of her, watching him work. "It's about an hour's ride to the ranch," he said. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Hank keeps horses for rent. I'll get you one." 10 minutes later, they were riding out of town, leaving behind the curious stares and whispered speculation. Clara sat her horse well. Not like a lady out for a leisure ride, but like someone who'd spent real time in the saddle. She didn't complain about the cold or ask questions about their destination. She just rode. The silence between them felt massive. After 20 minutes, Caleb couldn't stand it anymore. The letter you sent. You said you had no family. That's correct? What happened to them? Clara was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, cholera, 1883, my parents, my 2 younger brothers, and my sister, all within a week. The bluntness of it hit Caleb like a fist. I'm sorry. It was 2 years ago. I've made my peace with it. She paused. You didn't mention your own family in your advertisement. Dead too. Different reasons, different times, but dead all the same. I see. More silence. The horse's hooves made soft sounds on the half-frozen mud. A hawk circled overhead, searching for prey before the winter drove all the small animals underground. I should tell you, Clara said suddenly, that I have very little experience with wifely duties. Caleb felt heat rise in his face. I'm not expecting, that is, we don't have to... He stopped, frustrated with his own awkwardness. We can take things slow. I appreciate that. Her tone was neutral, businesslike. What I meant was household management. Cooking, cleaning, those sorts of things. I can do them, but I'm not expert. What did you do? Before? I was a school teacher in Pennsylvania. After my family died, the school board decided an unmarried woman without family connections wasn't suitable for the position. They let me go. That's bullshit, Caleb said, then immediately regretted his language. Sorry, I mean, no, you're right. It was bullshit. The word sounded strange coming from her, and for the first time he thought he saw the ghost of a smile on her face. But that's the world we live in. A woman alone has very few options, particularly a woman past 25 who's considered too old for a good match. You don't seem old. Thank you. You don't seem desperate. Caleb actually laughed, a short, surprised bark of sound. I am, though. Desperate. I wouldn't have placed that ad if I wasn't. Honesty. I appreciate that. Clara looked at him directly. I'm desperate too, Mr. Ward. Let's not pretend otherwise. We're both here because we're out of better options, but maybe that's not the worst foundation for a partnership. Partnership. Not marriage. The distinction felt important. Maybe not, Caleb agreed. They rode in silence for another 10 minutes before the ranch came into view. Caleb tried to see it through Clara's eyes. The house with its patched roof and sagging porch, the barn that leaned slightly to the left, the corrals that needed mending, the vast emptiness of land stretching out in every direction. It looked like exactly what it was, a place that required constant work just to keep from falling apart completely. Clara pulled her horse to a stop and stared at the ranch for a long moment. Caleb's stomach tightened, waiting for disappointment or regret, or fear to cross her face. Instead, she nodded once, decisively. It needs work. It does. The barn's structurally unsound. That lean will get worse over winter. I know. And the fence line on the eastern pasture is failing. I could see it from the road. Caleb stared at her. You know about fence lines? I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania, Mr. Ward. I know about a lot of things. She looked at him with those sharp, dark eyes. Is that a problem? No. He found himself meaning it. No, that's actually helpful. Good. Clara urged her horse forward. Then let's see what we're working with. The house was small, just 3 rooms and a loft. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all at once. A door on the left led to what had been Caleb's bedroom, and a ladder led up to the loft where he'd stored supplies and equipment he didn't have room for anywhere else. Clara walked through slowly, running her hand along the rough-hewn walls, testing the floorboards with her feet, examining the cast-iron stove with a critical eye. The stove works well? When it's not being temperamental, flue needs cleaning before winter. Windows need caulking. I can feel the draft from here. I know. I've been meaning to... The roof? Patched. Should hold through another winter, but it'll need replacing in the spring. Clara nodded, making mental notes. She moved to the bedroom door and paused, her hand on the frame. This is your room. Was. You should take it. I'll move my things to the loft. She turned to look at him, something unreadable in her expression. That's not necessary. The loft is storage, and you'll freeze up there once winter hits properly. I'm not putting you in the loft. Then we have a problem, Mr. Ward, because I'm not putting you there either. She crossed her arms. We're both adults. The bed is large enough to accommodate 2 people sleeping on opposite sides with appropriate boundaries. Unless you find that arrangement unacceptable, I suggest we simply share the space like the practical partners we claim to be. Caleb felt his face heating again. The thought of sharing a bed with this stranger, this sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued woman who'd been in his house for all of 10 minutes, made him deeply uncomfortable. But he couldn't fault her logic. Fine, he said, but I'll string a curtain down the middle, for privacy. That seems reasonable. The awkwardness of the moment was broken by a sound from outside, the anxious lowing of cattle. Caleb moved to the window and cursed under his breath. The sky had darkened considerably, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall. I need to move the herd closer to the shelter, he said. Storm's coming in faster than I thought. I'll help. You just got here. You should rest. Mr. Ward, Clara's voice stopped him. I didn't come here to rest. I came here to work. So either give me something useful to do or get out of my way while I find something myself. For a moment, Caleb just stared at her. Then, despite everything, the strangeness of the situation, the uncertainty of what he'd gotten himself into, the fear that this might all be a terrible mistake, he felt something unexpected. Relief. There's cold weather gear in the chest by the door, he said. Find something that fits well enough. We've got about 2 hours before this gets bad. Clara was already moving toward the chest. Then we'd better hurry. Dads. They worked in the fading light, driving the cattle toward the sheltered valley on the north side of the property where the hills would provide some protection from the wind. Clara rode like she'd been born to it, moving with the natural rhythm of someone who understood horses and didn't fear hard work. The snow was falling steadily now, thick flakes that clung to their coats and the horses' manes. Visibility was dropping fast, but Clara didn't slow down, didn't ask to stop, didn't show any sign of the fear that most frontier newcomers felt when they experienced their first Montana snowstorm. When they finally got the last of the cattle secured and started back toward the house, Caleb realized he was seeing Clara Whitfield more clearly than he had all day. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her hair had come completely loose from its pins, and her eyes were bright with something that looked almost like exhilaration. That was good work, he said as they dismounted in front of the barn. It was necessary work. She brushed snow from her coat. Your cattle are in poor condition, Mr. Ward. You've been underfeeding them. I know. Lost half my hay stores to rot last summer. Haven't had enough to spare. Then we'll need to supplement with something else. Do you have grain? Some. Not enough. We'll need to get creative then. She started unsaddling her horse with efficient movements. In Pennsylvania, we used to supplement with... A loud crack split the air, and the barn shuddered. Both of them froze. What was that? Clara asked. Caleb was already moving, searching the walls and support beams for damage. Snow load. The barn roof isn't strong enough to handle. Another crack, louder this time. Dust and old hay drifted down from above. Out, Caleb ordered. Now. They led the horses out quickly, getting them secured in the smaller stable attached to the house just as a third, longer crack echoed through the barn. Caleb watched from the doorway as part of the roof sagged inward. How bad? Clara asked, appearing beside him. Bad. If we get the heavy snow I think we're going to get, the whole thing might come down. Can we shore it up? Not in the dark, not in this storm. Caleb felt the familiar weight of defeat settling over him. Another problem he couldn't solve. Another piece of the ranch falling apart. We'll have to deal with it in the morning and hope it holds until then. He expected Clara to look worried or frightened or at least concerned. Instead, she was studying the barn with that same analytical expression she'd worn when examining the house. The support beam on the north side is cracked, she said. I saw it when we were inside. That's your weakest point. If we could brace it from the outside with something strong enough to distribute the weight, I don't have anything strong enough. Used all my spare timber on the house roof. Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, what about the old fence posts? The ones you replaced on the eastern pasture? Caleb stared at her. He dumped those posts in a pile behind the barn, figuring he'd eventually burn them for firewood. But she was right. Some of them were still solid enough to use as bracing. "That might work," he said slowly. "But we'd have to do it now, in the storm. And it'll take both of us." "Then let's go." "Clara, it's dangerous. If that roof comes down while we're working, then we'd better work fast." She was already moving, gathering rope from the stable, her jaw set with determination. "Are you coming, Mr. Ward, or am I doing this alone?" Caleb wanted to order her inside. Wanted to tell her she'd just arrived. She didn't know what she was doing. She could get hurt. But the look in her eyes stopped him. This wasn't recklessness. It was resolve. She'd sized up the problem, found a solution, and wasn't about to let fear or propriety stop her from executing it. She reminded him of himself, he realized. Back before the frontier had ground him down to bitter practicality. "I'm coming," he said, and together they walked back into the storm. But working in a blizzard was its own special kind of hell. The wind drove snow into every exposed inch of skin, turning simple tasks into exhausting battles. Caleb's fingers went numb within minutes despite his gloves. Beside him, Clara struggled with the heavy fence posts, her breath coming in visible clouds, but she never once suggested they stop. They worked by feel as much as sight, bracing the north wall with posts wedged at angles, securing them with rope and whatever lumber scraps Caleb could find. It was crude, improvised engineering, but it was working. Caleb could feel the structure stabilizing, the dangerous lean correcting itself degree by degree. "One more on this side, Amatz," he shouted over the wind. "Then we should be good." Clara nodded, already dragging another post into position. She was stronger than she looked, Caleb realized. Not just physically, though she'd proven herself there too, but in the deeper way that mattered out here. The frontier broke people who weren't strong enough in their core. It ground them down until they either adapted or fled back to civilization. Clara Whitfield wasn't going to break. They were securing the final post when it happened. The wind gusted harder than before, and somewhere above them, tortured wood finally gave up its fight. Caleb heard the crack and looked up just in time to see a section of roof caving inward, a support beam breaking free and swinging down like a falling axe. "Clara!" He grabbed her and yanked her backward, and they both crashed into the snow as the beam slammed down exactly where she'd been standing. It missed her by inches, embedding itself in the frozen ground with enough force to send up a spray of ice and dirt. For a moment, neither of them moved. They lay in the snow, Caleb's arms still wrapped around Clara, both of them breathing hard, staring at the beam that had nearly killed her. "Are you hurt?" Caleb finally managed. "No." Clara's voice was shaky, the first time he'd heard her sound anything other than completely composed. "No, You pulled me out of the way." Barely. Caleb became aware that he was still holding her, that her face was inches from his, that despite the cold, he could feel the warmth of her breath. He released her quickly and stood, offering his hand to help her up. "We need to get inside. Now!" Clara took his hand but didn't argue. They stumbled through the storm to the house, leaving behind the partially braced barn and the beam that had almost ended everything before it could begin. Inside, Caleb bolted the door against the wind and turned to find Clara standing in the middle of the room, melting snow pooling at her feet, staring at nothing. "Hey!" He moved closer, concerned now. "Clara, are you sure you're not hurt?" She looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Genuine fear. Not of the storm or the falling beam or the harsh frontier life she'd signed up for. Fear of what she'd almost lost. "I could have died," she said quietly. 5 hours after arriving at my new home, I could have been killed by a collapsing barn. But you weren't. Only because you grabbed me. You risked yourself to... It wasn't a risk. It was instinct. Caleb started peeling off his wet coat, trying to make the moment less intense. "You would have done the same." "Would I?" Clara looked down at her hands. "I don't know if I would have. I don't know if I'm that kind of person. You rode into a blizzard to save a barn that isn't even yours. You spent all afternoon working in the cold without complaint. He stopped, suddenly aware he was saying too much, revealing too much. "You're exactly the kind of person who would have." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she started removing her own wet coat, her movements slow and deliberate. "I should tell you something, Mr. Ward. Something I didn't include in my letter." Caleb felt his guard go up. "What?" I have a temper, a bad one. My father used to say I was too stubborn for my own good. And he wasn't wrong. I don't defer to people easily, and I have opinions about everything whether people want to hear them or not. She met his eyes. I'm not the quiet, obedient wife you probably imagined when you placed that advertisement. I noticed. And you should know, I'm not here because I dream of being a frontier rancher's wife. I'm here because I had nowhere else to go and no other options. If I'd had a choice, I probably wouldn't have chosen this. The word stung more than Caleb wanted to admit. You think I would have chosen this? Ordering a wife like supplies from a catalog? No. I think we're both here because life didn't give us better alternatives. Clara's voice was steady now, all traces of fear gone. But I also think we have a choice about what we do next. We can spend the next however many years resenting each other for what we're not, or we can try to make something workable out of what we are. Which is? Two stubborn people who don't know how to quit. She smiled, a real smile this time, small but genuine. That's got to count for something. Caleb found himself smiling back. Yeah, I think it does. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling around the house like something alive and angry. But inside, standing in the warm glow of lamplight, Caleb felt something shift. The woman across from him wasn't the fantasy wife he'd imagined when he placed that advertisement. She was difficult, opinionated, too smart for her own good, and completely unwilling to be anything other than herself. But maybe, just maybe, that was better. You should change into dry clothes, he said. I'll heat some water for tea. Tea sounds good. Clara moved toward the bedroom, then paused at the door. Mr. Ward? Thank you for pulling me out of the way. Caleb, if we're going to be married, you should call me Caleb. Caleb, she tested the name. Then you should call me Clara. All right, Clara. He liked the way it sounded. Get warm. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. After she disappeared into the bedroom, Caleb stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the storm rage outside and trying to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. He'd acquired a wife, a sharp-tongued, fearless, entirely unexpected wife who'd nearly died working to save his barn. The old Caleb would have seen this as confirmation of his worst fears, evidence that he'd made a terrible mistake. But standing here now, warming his frozen hands over the stove, Caleb felt something different. Not love. It was far too soon for that. But possibility. The sense that maybe this stranger he'd invited into his life might actually belong here. The storm could rage all it wanted. Inside, something was beginning to thaw. Tomorrow they would assess the damage, repair what could be repaired, and start the hard work of learning to exist together in this unforgiving place. But tonight, for the first time in years, Caleb Ward wasn't eating dinner alone. That had to count for something. Morning came with an eerie stillness that felt almost hostile after the violence of the previous night's storm. Caleb woke to find pale gray light filtering through the gaps in the curtain he'd strung down the middle of the bedroom. A makeshift division that felt both necessary and absurd now that he'd spent the night acutely aware of Clara's breathing on the other side. He'd barely slept. Every time he'd started to drift off, he'd become conscious of her presence. The rustle of blankets when she shifted position, the soft sound of her breath, the knowledge that a woman he'd known for less than a day was sleeping 3 feet away from him. It was the most intimate and least comfortable night he'd spent in years. When he pushed aside the curtain, he found her side of the bed already empty, blankets folded with military precision. He could hear movement in the main room, the clank of the stove being fed, the scrape of a pot on iron. Caleb dressed quickly and emerged to find Clara already fully dressed, her hair pinned back, working at the stove with the focused concentration of someone trying to solve a difficult puzzle. "Coffee's ready," she said without turning around. "I'm attempting something that might charitably be called breakfast, but I make no promises about its edibility." "You didn't have to. We both need to eat, and I need to learn this stove's temperament if I'm going to be cooking on it." She poked at something in the pan with more force than seemed necessary. "It runs hotter on the left side." "Yeah, the firebox is uneven. I've been meaning to fix it. I know." Clara turned to look at him, and Caleb was struck again by how direct her gaze was. No coyness, no downcast eyes, just straightforward assessment. "You have a long list of things you've been meaning to fix, Caleb Ward. I suspect we'll be working through it for quite some time." She wasn't wrong. Caleb poured himself coffee, strong and bitter, exactly how he liked it, and moved to the window. The world outside was buried under at least 8 inches of fresh snow, and more gray clouds promised there was plenty more where that came from. "We should check the barn," he said. "I was thinking the same thing." Clara scooped what looked like scrambled eggs onto 2 plates. They were slightly burned on one side, but Caleb had eaten far worse. "After we eat." They sat across from each other at the rough table, and Caleb realized this was their first real meal together. The significance of it felt strange, like they were playing at being husband and wife without quite knowing the rules of the game. "These are good," he said, which was mostly true. "You're a terrible liar, but I appreciate the effort." Clara ate with the same efficiency she seemed to bring to everything else. "I'll improve. My mother was an excellent cook, but she died before she could teach me everything she knew." "You said cholera took your family." "In less than a week. One day we were sitting down to Sunday dinner, and 7 days later I was the only one left." Her voice remained steady, but Caleb heard the weight beneath the words. "The town quarantined our house. By the time they let me out, everyone I loved was dead and buried, and I had nothing left except debts I couldn't pay, and a reputation as a carrier of disease. That's why you left Pennsylvania." "That's why I had to leave Pennsylvania. No one would hire me. No one would even look at me without fear in their eyes." She set down her fork. "The matrimonial advertisement was my last option. If you hadn't responded, I don't know what I would have done." The honesty of it hit Caleb hard. He thought of himself as the desperate one, the lonely rancher so pathetic he had to order a wife from a catalog. But Clara's desperation was different, darker. She hadn't been looking for companionship or help with the ranch. She'd been looking for survival. "I'm glad I responded," he said quietly. Clara looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Are you? Even after yesterday?" "Especially after yesterday. You didn't fall apart when things got difficult. You didn't complain or demand to be sent back. You just—" He struggled to find the right words. "You just got to work." "What else would I do? The barn needed fixing. Most women would have stayed inside where it was safe. Most women aren't trying to build a life on the Montana frontier." Clara stood and began clearing the dishes. "Besides, I'm not most women, Caleb. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for both of us." Caleb found himself smiling despite the seriousness of the conversation. "I'm starting to figure that out." Outside, the damage from the storm was worse than Caleb had feared, but better than it could have been. The barn had held, barely, thanks to their hasty bracing work. But the structure was clearly compromised, leaning more severely than before, and would need extensive repairs before it could safely house animals or equipment again. Clara walked the perimeter slowly, examining the damage with the same analytical eye she'd turned on everything else. Caleb watched her, noticing details he'd been too preoccupied to see the day before. The way she moved with purpose, never wasting motion. The small scar on her left hand, burn mark probably. The stubborn set of her jaw when she was thinking through a problem. "It's savable," she finally announced. "But it'll take work, real work. We'll need timber, better support beams, and probably 2 weeks of solid labor." "I don't have 2 weeks. I've got cattle to tend, fences to mend, and a dozen other—" "Then you'll have to make time." Clara's tone left no room for argument. "Because if this barn collapses during the next storm, you'll lose everything stored inside it, which, from what I can see, includes most of your winter feed, your tools, and probably equipment you can't afford to replace." She was right, and they both knew it. Caleb felt the familiar frustration of being stretched too thin, having too much work and not enough hours in the day to accomplish any of it properly. "I can't do it alone," he admitted. "Good thing you're not alone anymore." Clara turned to face him fully. "I can help with the cattle and the fences. I grew up doing that work. It'll free you up to focus on the barn." "Clara, I didn't bring you here to work yourself to death. No, you brought me here to be your wife. But I'm telling you what kind of wife I intend to be, the kind who doesn't sit idle while work needs doing." Her eyes challenged him to argue. "Unless you'd prefer I spend my days learning to embroider, or whatever it is you think frontier wives should do. I don't think—" Caleb stopped, realizing he was falling into a trap. You're doing it again. Doing what? Arguing with me before I've even disagreed with you. Clara's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. Old habit. I've spent the last 2 years fighting for every scrap of respect and dignity I could claim. It's hard to turn that off just because my circumstances have changed. I'm not trying to take your dignity, Clara. I'm trying to keep you from working yourself into an early grave during your first week here. And I appreciate that. But you need to understand something. She stepped closer, close enough that Caleb could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. I'm not fragile. I'm not going to break because the work is hard or the weather is bad or life on this ranch is difficult. I already survived the worst thing I can imagine surviving. Everything else is just work. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Caleb wanted to tell her that grief and physical labor were different things, that the frontier could break even the strongest people, that he was trying to protect her. But he could see from her expression that she'd heard all of that before and rejected it. So instead he said, "All right, you take the cattle. I'll start on the barn. But if you need help, I'll ask. I'm stubborn, not stupid." Clara was already heading toward the stable. Now, let's get moving before we lose any more daylight. The next week fell into a rhythm that was exhausting but strangely satisfying. Caleb worked on the barn from dawn until the light failed, tearing out damaged sections and replacing them with whatever materials he could salvage or improvise. Clara managed the cattle, riding out each morning to check on them, moving them between pastures, supplementing their feed with grain mixed with dried grass she harvested from the protected gullies. In the evenings, they worked together on the smaller tasks, mending tack, repairing tools, caulking windows against the increasingly bitter cold. They spoke little during these shared hours, but Caleb found himself becoming comfortable with the silence. It wasn't the oppressive loneliness he'd felt before Clara arrived. It was the quiet of two people working in parallel, each focused on their own task but aware of the other's presence. On the 8th day, Margaret Hutchins arrived unannounced, driving a wagon loaded with what she claimed were neighborly supplies, but what was clearly an excuse to inspect Caleb's new wife. "Mrs. Ward!" Margaret called out as Clara emerged from the stable, covered in hay and smelling distinctly of horse. "I thought I'd come by and see how you're settling in." Clara wiped her hands on her trousers, actual men's trousers that she'd taken to wearing for the heavy work, and approached the wagon with polite wariness. "Mrs. Hutchins, that's kind of you." Margaret's eyes traveled over Clara's unconventional attire, her work-roughened hands, the confident way she carried herself. Caleb could see disapproval forming in the older woman's expression. "I brought some preserves and bread," Margaret said, her tone carefully neutral. "Thought you might appreciate some proper cooking while you're getting established." "That's very thoughtful." Clara accepted the basket without any indication she'd caught the insult. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" "Oh, I couldn't impose." "It's no imposition. I'd welcome the company." Clara glanced at Caleb, and he caught the glimmer of something in her eyes. Not quite amusement, but close. Caleb was just about to take a break from his work anyway. "Weren't you, Caleb?" He recognized a command when he heard one, even when it was phrased as a question. "I was." Inside, Margaret settled herself at the table and launched into what was clearly a prepared interrogation disguised as friendly conversation. Where had Clara come from? What was her family background? Did she have experience managing a household? Had she given any thought to starting a family? Clara answered each question with polite directness, never volunteering more information than was asked for but never appearing evasive. Caleb watched her handle Margaret's nosiness with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else, and felt an unexpected surge of pride. "I must say," Margaret finally ventured, "you're quite different from what I expected." "In what way?" "Well," Margaret set down her coffee cup with a delicate clink. "Most mail-order brides are looking for security and comfort. They want to establish a proper home, start a family, settle into the traditional wifely roles. But you seem more interested in ranch work." "I'm interested in survival, Mrs. Hutchins." Clara's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "This ranch is my home now. Its success or failure directly affects my future. Why wouldn't I be invested in making it prosper?" "Of course, but there are appropriate roles for men and women. Surely you agree that I agree that work needs doing, and whoever is capable of doing it should do it. Claire refilled Margaret's coffee without being asked. Caleb needs help managing this ranch. I'm capable of providing that help. I fail to see the problem. Margaret's lips pursed. The problem, dear, is what people will say. A wife who works in the fields like a common laborer, who wears men's clothing, who doesn't seem interested in the domestic arts. It reflects poorly on your husband. Caleb had been trying to stay out of the conversation, but that brought him up short. Clara reflects just fine on me, Margaret. She's the hardest worker I've ever met, and this ranch is in better shape now than it's been in years. But surely you want a proper wife, someone who, I have exactly the wife I want. The words came out harder than Caleb intended, but he didn't regret them. Clara suits me just fine, and with all due respect, how we manage our marriage and our ranch is our business, not the town's. Margaret's expression shifted from disapproving to offended. She stood with rigid dignity. Well, I can see my concern isn't welcome. I was simply trying to offer friendly advice, but if you'd rather surround yourselves with scandal, we appreciate your concern, Mrs. Hutchins. Clara stood as well, her tone perfectly polite but dismissive. And thank you for the preserves. Shall I walk you to your wagon? After Margaret left in a cloud of barely suppressed indignation, Clara and Caleb stood on the porch watching the wagon disappear down the snow-covered road. I think you just made an enemy, Caleb said. Probably. Clara didn't sound particularly concerned. Does that bother you? Should it? Margaret Hutchins strikes me as the kind of woman who shapes town opinion. If she decides I'm scandalous, others will follow her lead. That could make things difficult for you. Caleb thought about it. A month ago, he might have cared what the town thought. A month ago, he'd been desperate enough for acceptance that he might have asked Clara to tone down her independence, to dress more conventionally, to act like the wife people expected. But that was before he'd seen her ride into a blizzard to save his barn. Before he'd watched her manage his cattle with skill that matched his own. Before he'd realized that Clara's strength wasn't something to be hidden or apologized for, it was the reason they might actually survive this. Let them talk, he said. We've got more important things to worry about. Clara turned to look at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her expression softened into something that looked almost like gratitude. You meant what you said in there, about me being the wife you want. I did. Even though I'm difficult and stubborn and completely wrong for the role? You're exactly right for the role. Caleb surprised himself with how much he meant it. Just not the role I thought I needed. Turns out I needed something different. The moment stretched between them, fragile and significant. Then Clara cleared her throat and stepped back, breaking the spell. Well, the cattle won't feed themselves, and you have a barn to finish. She was already moving toward the stable, back to the safety of work and routine. I'll be back before dark. Caleb watched her go, this complicated woman who'd upended his carefully planned life, and realized with startling clarity that he was glad she had. The loneliness that had driven him to place that advertisement felt like a distant memory now. Clara's presence had filled the silence in ways he hadn't expected, not with gentle domesticity or quiet companionship, but with challenge and purpose, and the simple reality of another human being who refused to let him give up. The barn repairs took another week, but when they were finished, the structure stood solid and true, stronger than it had been even before the storm. Caleb climbed down from the roof where he'd been securing the final section and found Clara waiting with a canteen of water and an expression of satisfaction. It looks good, she said. It'll hold. Caleb drank deeply, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. 2 weeks of hard physical labor had taken their toll. Thanks to your bracing idea. Thanks to both of us working ourselves half to death. Clara tilted her head back to examine the roofline. Your craftsmanship is solid, Caleb. Better than solid. Why was it falling apart before? Because I was trying to manage everything alone. Something always got neglected. He wiped sweat from his face despite the cold. I'd fix one thing and 2 others would break. Never could get ahead of it. And now? Now I have help. Makes a difference. Clara was quiet for a moment, then, the cattle are doing better too. I've been mixing grain with dried grass like my father used to do, and they're putting on weight again. We might actually get them through the winter in decent condition. It was the first time either of them had spoken about the future with any confidence. For 2 weeks, they'd been focused solely on immediate survival, fixing what was broken, feeding what was hungry, staying ahead of the relentless demands of the ranch. But now, standing in front of the repaired barn with winter settling in around them, Caleb felt something shift. They might actually make this work. "I need to go to town tomorrow," he said. "Pick up supplies before the next storm hits. You should come with me." Is that wise after the scene with Margaret Hutchins? Probably not. But I'm tired of hiding. You're my wife. People can accept that or not. Their choice. Clara smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face. All right then, we'll face the gossips together. The ride to Beaver Creek the next morning was cold but clear, the kind of Montana winter day where the sky was so blue it hurt to look at, and every breath came out in visible clouds. They rode side by side, and Caleb found himself studying Clara out of the corner of his eye. She'd dressed carefully for town, a proper dress, her hair pinned up neatly, none of the rough work clothes she wore around the ranch. But there was still something unmistakably different about her. The way she sat her horse, maybe, or the directness of her gaze. She would never pass for a conventional frontier wife, no matter what she wore. Caleb discovered he was fine with that. Town was busier than usual, with people stocking up before the serious winter weather set in. When Caleb and Clara rode down the main street, conversation stopped. People stared. Margaret Hutchins emerged from the general store and immediately turned her back, herding her daughters inside like Clara carried some contagious disease. "Well," Clara murmured, "this should be interesting." Inside the general store, the proprietor, a man named Jameson who'd always been fair with Caleb, greeted them with professional courtesy that didn't quite hide his curiosity. "Morning, Caleb. Mrs. Ward." He nodded to Clara. "What can I get for you folks?" Caleb rattled off his list while Clara examined the store's limited selection of fabrics and supplies. He was aware of other customers watching them, particularly a group of women clustered near the fabric counter who weren't even pretending not to stare. "I heard she works in the fields," one of them whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Like a common laborer." "Wears men's trousers," they say. "Well, what can you expect from a mail-order bride? No proper woman would—" "No proper woman would what?" Clara's voice cut through the whispers like a knife. She turned to face the women directly, and Caleb saw several of them actually take a step back. "I'm curious what you were about to say about mail-order brides. Please, continue." The woman who'd been speaking, Caleb recognized her as Pastor Henry's wife, Sarah, flushed red. "I didn't mean, that is, I was simply observing that I'm not a proper woman because I work to help my husband survive on a failing ranch." Clara's tone remained perfectly polite, but there was no mistaking the challenge in it. "Or perhaps you meant that no proper woman would have been desperate enough to marry a man she'd never met, just to have a roof over her head and food in her belly?" "Clara," Caleb said quietly, moving to her side. He didn't know whether to intervene or let this play out. But Clara wasn't finished. "Here's what I am, Mrs. Henry. I'm a woman whose entire family died and left her with nothing. I'm a woman who was cast out by her community for the crime of surviving when everyone she loved died. I'm a woman who chose to build a new life rather than starve in the streets. And yes, I work in the fields. I wear trousers when it's practical. I do whatever needs doing to help my husband make his ranch prosper." She paused, letting the words sink in. "If that makes me improper in your eyes, then I suppose I'll have to live with your disapproval." The store had gone completely silent. Even Jameson had stopped wrapping Caleb's supplies to listen. Sarah Henry looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. "I think perhaps we all got off on the wrong foot," another voice said. Caleb turned to see Doc Morrison, the town's physician and one of the few people Caleb actually respected, stepping forward. "Mrs. Ward, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Dr. Morrison, and I, for one, think the frontier needs more women with your spirit, not fewer." Clara's rigid posture softened slightly. "Dr. Morrison, it's a pleasure." "The pleasure is mine. Tell me, is it true you've been managing Ward's cattle? I heard rumors but dismissed them as exaggeration." "It's true. I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania. Cattle, horses, crops. I did it all." "Remarkable." Doc Morrison shot a pointed look at the cluster of women. You know, my late wife used to say that the measure of a person wasn't how well they followed convention, but how well they rose to meet their challenges. By that standard, Mrs. Ward, you're measuring up quite admirably. It wasn't quite an endorsement from the whole town, but coming from Doc Morrison, who everyone trusted, it was close enough. The tension in the store eased fractionally. The women at the fabric counter dispersed, still whispering but with less venom. Later, as they loaded their supplies onto the horses, Caleb couldn't help but ask, "Did you plan that? The speech?" "No, I was honestly just tired of being whispered about." Clara secured a sack of grain with efficient movements. "Was it too much?" "It was perfect." Caleb found himself grinning. "You should have seen Sarah Henry's face. I don't think anyone's ever stood up to her like that." "Yes, well, I've spent 2 years being deferential and apologetic, and it got me nowhere. I'm done apologizing for being who I am." She swung into her saddle with easy grace. "If that causes problems, let it cause problems. I'm tired of worrying about what people think." Caleb mounted his own horse, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Besides, you were right about everything." They rode out of town together, and if people stared or whispered, neither of them cared anymore. They had a ranch to run, winter to survive, and each other to rely on. Everything else was just noise. That night, working together to put away the supplies they'd bought, Caleb realized something had fundamentally changed between them. They moved around each other with an ease that hadn't been there before, anticipating each other's movements, working in comfortable silence. It felt less like two strangers forced together by circumstance and more like partnership. Exactly what Clara had called it that first day. "I'm glad you came here," Caleb said suddenly, surprising himself. Clara looked up from the sack of flowers she was storing. "Even though I've caused you nothing but trouble?" "You haven't caused trouble. You've caused change. There's a difference." "Is there?" But she was smiling. "There is." Caleb set down the box he was carrying and met her eyes. "A month ago, I was drowning in work and loneliness and didn't even realize it. I'd convinced myself that just surviving was enough. But you," he struggled to find the right words, "you made me remember that life can be more than just getting through each day." Clara was very still. "Caleb, I'm not saying I love you. It's too soon for that, and we both know this started as a practical arrangement." He took a breath. "But I like you, Clara. I respect you. And I'm grateful you answered that advertisement, because I think you might be exactly what I needed, even if I was too stupid to know it." For a long moment, Clara just looked at him. Then she crossed the space between them and took his hand, rough, work-worn fingers closing around his own. "I like you too," she said quietly. "And I respect what you're trying to build here. I want to help you build it. Not because I have to, but because I choose to." They stood there in the lamplight, holding hands like awkward teenagers, and Caleb felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in his chest. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become love, given time and patience and the willingness to see each other clearly. Outside, the first flakes of new snow began to fall, promising another storm on the way. But inside, two people who'd started as strangers were slowly becoming something more. The snow kept coming. 3 days after their trip to town, Caleb woke to find the world buried under 2 feet of fresh powder, with drifts against the north side of the house reaching nearly to the windowsills. The wind had died during the night, leaving behind the kind of profound silence that only heavy snow could create. Beside him, separated by the curtain that had become more symbolic than functional, he heard Clara stirring. They'd fallen into a routine over the past weeks, waking at dawn, working until exhaustion forced them to stop, falling into bed with barely enough energy for conversation. It was a hard life, but Caleb found himself grateful for it in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "How bad is it?" Clara's voice came from the other side of the curtain. "Bad enough. We'll need to dig out before we can do anything else." He heard her sigh, then the rustle of blankets as she got up. They dressed on their respective sides of the curtain, maintaining the illusion of privacy, even though they'd long since become comfortable with each other's presence. When Caleb emerged into the main room, Clara was already stoking the fire, her hair still loose down her back in a way that made him forget to breathe for just a moment. She caught him staring and raised an eyebrow. What? Nothing. Just, you should wear your hair down more often. Color rose in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. It's impractical for work. I know, but it's nice. He moved to the window, suddenly awkward. I'll start on the path to the barn. Can you check the food stores? We might be snowed in for a while. Already planning to. Clara began pinning up her hair with practiced efficiency, and Caleb felt an irrational disappointment at seeing it disappear. Caleb, are we going to be all right, food-wise? Should be. We stocked up good after the last trip to town. He pulled on his heaviest coat. Might get tired of salt pork and beans, but we won't starve. What he didn't say was that being snowed in with Clara didn't frighten him the way it would have a month ago. Then, the prospect of weeks trapped in close quarters with a stranger would have felt like torture. Now, it felt almost comfortable. They'd learned each other's rhythms, figured out how to exist in the same small space without driving each other mad. The digging took most of the morning. Caleb carved a path through the snow to the barn, while Clara worked on clearing the porch and creating a secondary route to the woodpile. The physical labor was brutal. The snow was heavy and wet, each shovelful feeling like it weighed 20 pounds. But there was something meditative about it too, the repetitive motion allowing his mind to wander. He thought about the letter he'd written 4 months ago, advertising for a wife like she was a piece of equipment he needed for the ranch. He thought about Clara stepping off that stagecoach, tall and proud, and nothing like what he'd expected. He thought about the moment in the blizzard when that beam had nearly killed her, and how his body had moved before his brain could process the danger. When had she stopped being a stranger? When had this arrangement stopped feeling like a business transaction and started feeling like something real? Caleb! Clara's shout jerked him from his thoughts. She was standing near the woodpile, gesturing urgently. The cattle! He looked where she was pointing and cursed. 3 of his cows had wandered away from the sheltered valley, probably during the storm, and were now stuck in a snowdrift about 100 yards from the house. Even from this distance, he could see they were in trouble, their movements sluggish with cold and exhaustion. I'll get them, he started, but Clara was already moving. We'll both go. It'll be faster with 2 of us. She was right, though Caleb hated putting her at risk. They grabbed rope and moved as quickly as the deep snow would allow, fighting through drifts that came up to their thighs in places. The cattle were in bad shape. One of them was lying down, a dangerous sign in weather this cold. That one first, Clara said, pointing to the downed cow. If she stays down much longer, she won't get back up. They worked together, getting ropes around the animal and pulling with combined strength. The cow resisted at first, bellowing her distress, but finally heaved to her feet. Caleb kept tension on the rope while Clara moved to the other 2 animals, speaking to them in a low, calm voice that seemed to cut through their panic. That's it. Easy now. Come on, girls. Let's get you somewhere warm. It took nearly an hour to get all 3 cattle back to the sheltered area and secured. By the time they finished, both Caleb and Clara were soaked through with snow and sweat, shivering despite the heavy labor. Inside, Caleb ordered, before we both freeze to death. Back in the house, Clara's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. Caleb got the fire built up high while she peeled off her wet outer layers with clumsy, frozen fingers. Here! He brought her a blanket and a cup of hot coffee. Drink this. You too. You're just as cold as I am. She was right. Caleb could feel the dangerous numbness spreading through his extremities. He wrapped himself in his own blanket and sat close to the fire, and without discussing it, Clara moved to sit beside him. They huddled together, sharing warmth, waiting for feeling to return to their frozen limbs. That was close, Clara said after a while, when her shivering had subsided enough to speak clearly. Another hour and we would have lost them. Thanks to you, we didn't. You spotted them before I did. We make a good team. She said it simply, like it was just a fact. But Caleb heard the deeper meaning underneath. Yeah, we do. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire, and Caleb became aware of how close they were sitting. Close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. Close enough that if he shifted just slightly, their shoulders would touch. He didn't shift away. Caleb? Clara's voice was quiet. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you really place that advertisement? And don't say it was just practical. I've seen you work. You're capable of managing this ranch alone if you have to. So what was it really? Caleb thought about deflecting, giving her the easy answer about needing help. But they'd been honest with each other from the start, and he owed her the truth. I was lonely, he said finally. So lonely I thought I might go crazy with it. I'd spend weeks without hearing another human voice, and I started forgetting things. Forgetting what it felt like to have a conversation, to share a meal with someone, to know that another person in the world gave a damn whether I lived or died. He stared into the fire. The work was hard, but the loneliness was worse. It was eating me alive from the inside out. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and took his hand, threading her cold fingers through his. I know that feeling, she said softly. After my family died, I spent months completely alone. The town quarantined me, and even after the quarantine ended, people avoided me like I was cursed. I'd go days without speaking to anyone. Weeks, sometimes. And the silence, she shuddered. The silence was suffocating. Is that why you answered the advertisement? Partly, but also because I wanted to matter to someone again. When my family was alive, I mattered. I was a daughter, a sister, a teacher. I had purpose and value, and people who cared about me. After they died, I was just nothing. A ghost haunting an empty house. She squeezed his hand. I thought maybe, out here, I could matter again. Even if it was just to one person. Caleb turned to look at her and found her already watching him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and her face was flushed from the cold and the fire. She looked vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before, all her usual armor stripped away. You matter, Clara, he said, his voice rough. You matter to me. More than I expected, if I'm being honest. Good. A tear spilled over, tracking down her cheek. Because you matter to me too. And I need you to know this isn't just a practical arrangement anymore. Not for me. Caleb's heart was hammering in his chest. What is it then? I don't know yet, but it's more. It's becoming something more. The space between them felt charged, electric. Caleb was acutely aware of her hand in his, the way her breath caught slightly, the way she was looking at him like he was the only person in the world that mattered. He leaned forward, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't pull away. Their lips met tentatively at first, a gentle exploration that sent warmth flooding through Caleb's frozen body. Then Clara made a small sound in the back of her throat and deepened the kiss, her free hand coming up to cup the back of his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. Was that all right? He asked. More than all right. Clara's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. I've been wanting you to do that for weeks. You could have kissed me first, you know. I could have, but I wanted to make sure you wanted it too. That it wasn't just obligation or proximity or… Caleb kissed her again, cutting off her nervous rambling. This time there was nothing tentative about it. This was certainty, desire, the culmination of weeks of growing attachment and unspoken longing. When they separated again, Clara was laughing softly. I think that answered my question. Just so we're clear, this has nothing to do with obligation. I'm kissing you because I want to, because I've been thinking about it for days and I'm tired of pretending I haven't. Good, because I'm tired of pretending too. She shifted closer, tucking herself against his side. This changes things, doesn't it? I suppose it does. Caleb wrapped his arm around her shoulders, marveling at how right it felt. Is that a problem? No, I want to make sure we're on the same page. I'm not expecting declarations of love or grand romantic gestures, but I need to know this is real for you, that I'm not just a convenient solution to your loneliness problem. Caleb pulled back enough to look at her directly. Clara Whitfield Ward, you are the least convenient woman I've ever met. You argue with me, challenge me, refuse to do things the easy way, and have completely upended every expectation I had about what my life would look like. He brushed a strand of hair back from her face. But you're also the bravest, most capable, most remarkable person I know. And what I feel for you has nothing to do with convenience and everything to do with who you are. More tears spilled over, but Clara was smiling through them. That might be the most words I've ever heard you string together at once. Don't get used to it. I'm not much for speeches. I don't need speeches. I just needed to know you see me, really see me, not just what I can do for the ranch or how I can make your life easier. I see you. Caleb meant it with everything in him. I see how strong you are, how smart, how determined. I see the way you refuse to let this frontier break you. I see the grief you carry and how you keep moving forward despite it. I see all of you, Clara, and I like what I see. She kissed him again, soft and sweet, then settled back against his chest with a contented sigh. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire and listening to the wind pick up outside, signaling another wave of the storm. We should probably eat something, Clara eventually said, though she made no move to get up. Probably. And check on the cattle again. Mm-hmm. And I should pin my hair back up. It's completely impractical like this. Don't you dare. Caleb tightened his arm around her. Let's just stay here for a few more minutes. The work can wait. Clara laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Caleb Ward, are you actually suggesting we put off work for the sake of sitting by the fire? I am. The world won't end if we take an hour for ourselves. No, I suppose it won't. She laced her fingers through his. All right then, an hour. The storm raged for 3 more days, keeping them effectively imprisoned in the house. But instead of the cabin fever Caleb had always feared during long, snowbound periods, he found himself almost grateful for the forced proximity. They cooked together, told stories about their pasts, played cards with a worn deck Caleb had forgotten he owned, and slowly let down the last barriers between them. On the second night of the storm, Clara removed the curtain that had divided their bed. It seems silly to maintain the pretense, she said, folding the fabric with careful precision. Unless you'd prefer to keep it. Caleb's mouth was dry. No pretense. That night they lay side by side in the darkness, not touching but aware of each other in a way that made Caleb's skin feel electric. He could hear Clara's breathing, feel the warmth of her body mere inches away. Caleb? Her voice was small in the darkness. Yeah? I'm scared. Of what? Of how much I'm starting to care about you, of how quickly this is all happening, of what it will mean if… She trailed off, but he understood what she couldn't say. What it would mean if this didn't work out, if they were making a mistake, if the growing feelings between them proved fragile in the harsh light of frontier reality. He reached out in the darkness and found her hand. I'm scared too, but I'd rather be scared with you than safe and alone. Clara rolled toward him, and suddenly they were face to face in the darkness. He could barely see her features, but he could feel her breath on his face, could sense the tension in her body. Can I be close to you? She whispered. Just to sleep. I just want to be close. In answer, Caleb pulled her against him, and Clara settled into his arms with a sigh that sounded like coming home. They fit together perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her arm draped across his chest. It was intimate and innocent at the same time, the simple comfort of human contact after too long alone. This is nice, Clara murmured, already half asleep. Yeah. Caleb pressed a kiss to the top of her head. It really is. When morning came, they woke tangled together, and neither of them pulled away. It became their new normal, working side by side during the day, falling asleep in each other's arms at night. The physical intimacy remained chaste, both of them seeming to sense that they needed time to let their emotional connection catch up to the intensity of their feelings. But the tenderness between them grew. Caleb found himself reaching for Clara's hand while they worked. Clara would press kisses to his temple when she passed his chair. They developed a language of small touches and quiet moments that spoke louder than words. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. They emerged into a world transformed. Snow piled higher than Caleb had seen in years, every surface blanketed in pristine white, the sky a brilliant blue that hurt to look at. It's beautiful, Clara breathed, standing on the porch and surveying the landscape. It's deadly, Caleb corrected, though he couldn't entirely disagree. That much snow means the cattle will have a hard time finding food, and if there's ice underneath, we could lose animals to broken legs. Always practical. But Clara was smiling. What do we do first? Check the herd, make sure they all made it through, then start clearing paths and breaking ice on the water troughs. They worked all day in the brilliant cold, and by evening both were exhausted but satisfied. The cattle had survived, all of them, and the damage to the ranch infrastructure was minimal. As the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of fire, Caleb stood with Clara on the porch and felt something close to contentment. "We did it," Clara said softly. "We survived our first big storm together." "First of many." Caleb pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Winter's just getting started." "I know, but we can handle it." She leaned back against him. "We can handle anything together." Caleb wanted to believe that, wanted to trust that what they'd built over the past weeks was strong enough to weather whatever the frontier threw at them. But he'd lived on this land long enough to know that confidence and survival weren't the same thing. Still, standing here with Clara in his arms, watching the sunset paint their world in impossible colors, he allowed himself to hope. The next week brought more snow, but lighter, a steady accumulation rather than the violent storm they'd endured. Caleb and Clara fell into an easy rhythm, working together to keep the ranch running, stealing moments of tenderness when they could. It was during one of these moments, Caleb teaching Clara how to repair a broken harness while she insisted there was a more efficient method, that they heard the sound of approaching horses. They both looked up, tension immediately replacing the easy comfort of seconds before. Visitors were rare this deep into winter, and unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, moving slowly through the deep snow. As they got closer, Caleb recognized the lead rider, Thomas Brennan, who owned the ranch to the north. The other 2 he didn't know, but they had the look of ranch hands, weathered and hard. "Ward!" Brennan called out as he approached. "Need to talk to you." Caleb stepped forward, subtly positioning himself between the riders and Clara. "Brennan, what brings you out in this weather?" Brennan dismounted, his expression grim. "We've got a problem, a big one. Wolves have been hitting the ranches up north, killing livestock. Took down 5 of my cattle in one night, and I've heard reports from other ranchers of similar losses." "How many wolves are we talking about?" "Pack of at least 8, maybe more. They're organized and bold, hitting in broad daylight sometimes. We're organizing a hunting party to track them down before they decimate our herds." Brennan's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to Caleb. "We need every able-bodied man we can get. You in?" Caleb felt Clara stiffen beside him. "When?" "Tomorrow morning. We'll ride out at first light, follow the tracks while they're still fresh. Could be gone 3-4 days, depending on how far we have to track them." "4 days?" Clara spoke for the first time, her voice tight. "That's a long time to be gone in winter." Brennan looked at her with barely concealed disdain. "That's frontier life, ma'am. Sometimes the men have to handle dangerous work while the women keep the home fires burning." Caleb felt Clara's anger like a physical force, but she kept her voice level. "I'm perfectly capable of handling a rifle. If you need hunters, I can—" "Clara." Caleb put a hand on her arm, not to silence her, but to forestall the argument he could see coming. "Can you give us a minute?" She looked at him sharply, clearly not pleased at being dismissed, but nodded stiffly and went back into the house. Caleb waited until the door closed before turning back to Brennan. "She's right, you know. Clara can shoot better than half the men in this county." "Maybe so, but a wolf hunt in deep winter is no place for a woman." Brennan's tone made it clear this wasn't up for discussion. "So are you in or not? We need an answer now." Caleb thought about Clara alone on the ranch for 4 days in the middle of winter. Thought about the cattle that needed tending, the work that needed doing, the 1,000 things that could go wrong without him there. But he also thought about wolves decimating his herd, about the threat they posed not just to his livelihood, but to every rancher in the territory. "I'm in," he said finally. "But I'll need a few hours to make arrangements." "Fair enough. We're meeting at the Hutchins place at dawn. Don't be late." Brennan swung back into his saddle. "And Ward, leave your wife at home. This is men's work." After they rode off, Caleb stood in the snow for a long moment, dreading the conversation he was about to have. Then he squared his shoulders and went inside. Clara was standing by the window, her arms crossed, her expression stormy. "You're going." "I have to. If those wolves hit our herd—" "I know. I understand the necessity." She turned to face him. "What I don't understand is why I can't come with you." "Clara." Don't you dare say it's because I'm a woman. Don't you dare, Caleb. I wasn't going to. He moved closer, choosing his words carefully. But someone needs to stay here and manage the ranch. The cattle need tending, the water troughs need breaking. So you stay, and I'll go hunt wolves. You know that won't work. Brennan and the others won't accept a woman on the hunting party. Then they're fools. Maybe. But they're fools I need to cooperate with if I'm going to survive out here. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. Clara, I'm not trying to sideline you. I'm trying to be practical. Someone has to stay, and you're more than capable of managing things while I'm gone. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her jaw working. Finally, she said, I hate this. I hate that I can't go simply because of my gender. I hate that I have to stay behind while you ride into danger. And I really hate that you're right about the practical necessity of it. I know. Caleb pulled her into his arms, relieved when she didn't resist. I don't like it either. The thought of leaving you here alone for 4 days makes my stomach hurt. I'll be fine. I'm not helpless. I know you're not, but I'll worry anyway. He kissed the top of her head. Promise me you'll be careful. Don't take unnecessary risks. If anything feels wrong, if you sense any danger at all, you get inside and bar the door. I promise. Clara pulled back to look at him. And you promise me you won't do anything stupid. Those wolves are dangerous, and I need you to come back in one piece. I promise. They spent the rest of the evening preparing, Caleb gathering his hunting gear while Clara made careful notes about the ranch task that would need attention in his absence. They went through every detail twice, making sure Clara knew where everything was and what to do in various emergencies. That night in bed, they held each other closer than usual, both acutely aware of the coming separation. 4 days, Clara whispered in the darkness. It doesn't seem that long, but it feels like forever. Caleb tightened his arms around her. I'll come back as fast as I can. You'd better. I'm not running this ranch alone any longer than necessary. He smiled against her hair, practical to the end. Someone has to be, but her voice was thick with emotion. Caleb, be safe. Please. I will. I promise. When dawn came, Caleb dressed in heavy layers while Clara made coffee and packed food for his journey. They moved quietly, preserving the fragile peace of the early morning. When it was time to go, Caleb pulled Clara into a fierce embrace. I'll be back before you know it. I'm counting on it. Clara kissed him hard, pouring everything she couldn't say into the contact. When she pulled away, her eyes were bright but determined. Go hunt your wolves, Caleb Ward. I'll keep your ranch alive while you're gone. Caleb mounted his horse and looked back at Clara standing on the porch, strong and beautiful and terrifyingly alone. Every instinct screamed at him to stay, to protect her, to not leave her vulnerable. But the frontier didn't care about instincts or fear. It demanded hard choices and trust in the people you loved. So Caleb turned his horse toward the north and rode away from his ranch, from his wife, from everything that had come to matter to him. And with every step his horse took through the deep snow, he felt the distance between them like a physical ache. Behind him, Clara stood on the porch until he disappeared from view, then squared her shoulders and turned back to face the ranch alone. 4 days. They could survive 4 days apart. They'd survived worse. The silence that settled over the ranch after Caleb rode away was different from any silence Clara had known before. It wasn't the suffocating quiet of her quarantined house in Pennsylvania, filled with the ghosts of her dead family. It wasn't the hollow emptiness of her final months back east, when she'd been invisible to everyone around her. This silence had weight and texture. The creak of the house settling, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the snow-laden pines. This silence meant she was alone, yes, but not abandoned. Caleb would come back. She had to believe that. Clara forced herself to move, to focus on the work that needed doing. Standing on the porch staring at the empty horizon wouldn't bring him home any faster. She checked the cattle first, counting heads twice to make sure none had wandered off during the night. They were all accounted for, huddled together in the sheltered valley, their breath rising in clouds of vapor in the frigid morning air. The water troughs had frozen over again despite her breaking the ice the previous evening. Clara grabbed the iron bar they kept for this purpose and began the tedious work of smashing through the thick ice, her breath coming in harsh gasps that crystallized instantly in the cold air. The physical labor felt good. kept her mind from wandering to all the terrible things that could happen to a man hunting wolves in deep winter. By midday, she'd completed most of the essential tasks on Caleb's carefully written list: feed the cattle, break the ice, check the barn supports, bring in more firewood. Each completed task felt like a small victory, proof that she could handle this, that she wasn't the helpless woman Thomas Brennan clearly thought her to be. She was hauling the last load of firewood when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the normal symphony of ranch life. Horses. Multiple horses, moving fast. Clara's hand went instinctively to the rifle she'd taken to carrying whenever she was outside. She set down the firewood and moved to where she could see the approach without being immediately visible herself. Years of living on a farm had taught her that unexpected visitors could mean anything from harmless neighbors to serious trouble. Two riders came into view, and Clara's stomach tightened when she recognized one of them. Margaret Hutchins sat ramrod straight in her saddle, her face pinched with cold and something that looked like grim determination. The other rider was a man Clara didn't recognize, younger, maybe mid-20s, with the soft hands and clean clothes of someone who didn't do much manual labor. Clara stepped out where they could see her, the rifle held casually but obviously. "Mrs. Hutchins, what brings you out here?" Margaret's eyes went immediately to the rifle, and her lips thinned with disapproval. "Mrs. Ward, we heard your husband rode out with the hunting party this morning." "He did?" "Then you're here alone." It wasn't a question. "I am." "What of it?" The young man shifted in his saddle, and Margaret gestured to him. "This is my nephew, Robert Hutchins, recently arrived from St. Louis. When I heard you'd been left alone, I thought it only proper that Robert stay here to provide protection and assistance until your husband returns." Clara felt a flash of irritation so intense it took effort to keep her voice level. "That won't be necessary. I'm perfectly capable of managing the ranch myself." "I'm sure you think you are, dear, but a woman alone is vulnerable. Anything could happen. Wolves, thieves, accidents. It simply isn't safe or proper." "Mrs. Hutchins, I appreciate your concern, but it's already decided." Margaret's tone turned imperious. "Robert will stay in your barn and help with the heavy work. It's only for a few days, and it's the Christian thing to do." Clara's grip tightened on the rifle. She could see what this really was: Margaret's way of maintaining control, of enforcing her vision of how a proper frontier wife should behave. The older woman couldn't stand that Clara had defied expectations, and now she was using Caleb's absence as an excuse to impose her nephew on the situation. "No," Clara said flatly. Margaret blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no. Thank you for the offer, but I don't need or want Robert's help. I'm managing fine on my own." Robert finally spoke, his voice carrying the condescending tone of someone used to being obeyed. "Mrs. Ward, I think you're not understanding the danger of your situation. A woman alone is standing in front of you holding a rifle she knows how to use." Clara let steel enter her voice. "I've broken ice, fed cattle, repaired fence, and managed every aspect of this ranch alongside my husband. I don't need a stranger staying on my property to do work I'm fully capable of doing myself." "But surely," Margaret started. "Mrs. Hutchins, I'm going to be blunt because I'm cold and tired and running out of patience. I don't want Robert here. My husband didn't ask for Robert to be here. This ranch is our property, and I'm telling you, politely but firmly, to take your nephew and go home." Margaret's face flushed red. "You ungrateful, stubborn woman! I'm trying to help you." "No, you're trying to prove that I can't manage without a man supervising me. You're trying to show the town that I'm not capable of handling frontier life, that I'm some helpless Eastern girl who needs constant protection." Clara took a step forward. "But here's the truth, Mrs. Hutchins. I've survived things that would have broken you. I've lost everything and rebuilt myself from nothing. And I'll be damned if I let you or anyone else make me feel weak or incapable just because I don't fit your narrow definition of what a woman should be." The words hung in the frozen air like a challenge. Robert looked uncomfortable, clearly caught in the middle of something he didn't fully understand. Margaret looked like she'd been slapped. "You'll regret this," Margaret said coldly. "When something happens, and mark my words, something will happen, don't come crying to the town for help." "I won't need to." Clara's voice was ice. "Now please leave my property." They left, Margaret rigid with fury, Robert looking relieved to escape. Clara watched them disappear into the trees before allowing herself to tremble with the aftershock of confrontation. She'd just made a powerful enemy, she knew. Margaret Hutchins was the kind of woman who held grudges and had the social influence to make life difficult, but Clara couldn't bring herself to regret it. She'd spent too long being pushed around, being told what she could and couldn't do, being made to feel lesser simply because of her gender. If standing up for herself meant Margaret's disapproval, then so be it. That night, Clara barred the door and checked the rifle twice before allowing herself to relax. The house felt emptier than it had even on her first night here, when Caleb had been a stranger sleeping on the other side of a curtain. Now she knew exactly what she was missing: the sound of his breathing, the warmth of his body beside her, the simple comfort of knowing she wasn't alone. She made herself a simple dinner and sat at the table, Caleb's empty chair a constant reminder of his absence. One day down, she told herself. 3 more to go. She could do this. The second day brought new challenges. Clara woke to discover that one of the cattle had gotten tangled in broken fence wire during the night. The animal was panicked, thrashing against the wire and making the situation worse with each movement. Clara approached slowly, speaking in the calm, low voice that had worked before. "Easy now, easy. Let me help you." The cow's wild eyes rolled toward her, and for a moment Clara thought the animal might bolt, potentially breaking its leg or tearing itself open on the wire. But she kept talking, kept moving slowly, until she was close enough to assess the damage. The wire was wrapped around the cow's rear leg, cutting into the hide, but not deep enough to cause serious injury if she could get it loose. Clara set down her rifle, out of kicking range but within reach, and pulled on her heaviest gloves. The wire was old and rusty, frozen stiff by the cold, and removing it required getting dangerously close to the cow's hooves. One well-placed kick could break ribs or worse. "Just stay still. Please just stay still." She worked the wire loose bit by bit, her fingers aching even through the gloves. The cow shifted nervously but didn't kick, as if some part of its animal brain understood she was trying to help. When the last loop of wire finally came free, Clara stepped back quickly, giving the animal room to move away. The cow limped off, favoring the injured leg but otherwise mobile. Clara watched it rejoin the herd, then gathered up the dangerous wire to dispose of properly. It was only when she was walking back to the house that she realized her hands were shaking. That could have gone so wrong. The cow could have kicked her, breaking bones and leaving her injured and alone with no help for days. The wire could have been wrapped tighter, causing damage that would have required putting the animal down. A dozen different disasters had been averted by nothing more than luck and the cow's cooperation. Clara sat down heavily on the porch steps, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of her situation. She was alone on a failing ranch in the middle of a Montana winter, responsible for everything and everyone. If something went seriously wrong, if she got badly hurt, if the cattle got sick, if the barn collapsed or the house caught fire, there was no one to help her. No safety net, no backup plan. For the first time since Caleb left, Clara allowed herself to feel the fear she'd been pushing down. She was terrified. Not of the work or the weather or even the possibility of wolves. She was terrified of failing, of proving everyone right who'd said she couldn't handle this life, of letting Caleb down when he'd trusted her to keep things running. She sat there for a long time, letting herself feel all of it, the fear and the exhaustion and the loneliness. Then she took a deep breath, stood up, and got back to work. Fear was fine, she told herself. Fear meant she understood the stakes. But fear didn't get to stop her from doing what needed to be done. The third day started with snow. Not the violent blizzard they'd weathered before, but a steady, relentless snowfall that by noon had added another 6 inches to the already impressive accumulation. Clara spent the morning redigging paths that had filled in overnight, her back screaming in protest by the time she finished. She was breaking ice on the water troughs for the second time that day when she heard it, a sound that sent ice water through her veins. Howling. Wolf howls, closer than they should be, coming from the direction of the northern tree line. Clara grabbed her rifle and scanned the landscape, her heart pounding. There, movement among the trees. Dark shapes, low to the ground, moving with predatory grace. Wolves. At least 5 that she could see, possibly more hidden in the forest. They were watching the cattle. Clara's mind raced. She was one person with one rifle against a pack of wolves who were clearly hunting. If they decided to attack the herd, there was no way she could stop them all. She could maybe kill one, possibly two if she was lucky, but the rest would scatter and pick off cattle at will. The wolves began to spread out, clearly preparing to surround the herd. Clara had minutes at most to make a decision. She fired the rifle into the air, a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. The wolves froze, their attention snapping to her. Clara fired again, then began yelling at the top of her lungs, making herself as loud and threatening as possible. "Get out! Go on! Get out of here!" She fired a third shot, this one deliberately placed to kick up snow near the closest wolf. The animal yelped and jumped back, startled. The pack hesitated, uncertain. They were used to easy prey, not aggressive resistance. Clara kept yelling, kept firing, careful not to actually hit the wolves, but close enough to scare them, to make them understand that this herd was protected. She advanced on them, refusing to show the fear that threatened to freeze her in place. Finally, the pack leader, a large gray wolf with scarred muzzle, made the decision to retreat. The wolves melted back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. But Clara knew they hadn't gone far. They'd be back, probably after dark, when they could attack from multiple directions under cover of darkness. She couldn't defend the herd alone at night. She needed help, needed more eyes, needed something she didn't have. Clara stood in the snow, breathing hard, trying to think. She could bring the cattle closer to the house, into the smaller corral that would be easier to defend. It would be cramped, and the cattle wouldn't like it, but it was better than losing them to wolves. She spent the next 3 hours moving the herd, using every trick her father had taught her about cattle management. The animals were reluctant, sensing her agitation and the scent of wolves on the wind, but Clara was relentless, driving them forward, refusing to let any stragglers fall behind. By the time she got the last cow secured in the corral near the house, darkness was falling and Clara was so exhausted she could barely stand. But she couldn't rest yet. She fortified the corral as best she could, stacking anything heavy she could move to block potential entry points. She positioned lanterns around the perimeter. Wolves hated fire and might be deterred by the light. Then she settled in for a long night, rifle in her lap, coffee going cold beside her, watching the darkness for movement. The wolves came back around midnight. Clara heard them before she saw them. The soft padding of feet in snow, the low growls of communication. She stood up slowly, every muscle protesting, and raised the rifle. Dark shapes circled the corral, testing for weaknesses. The cattle were agitated, pressing together in the center, their eyes rolling white with fear. Clara tracked the wolves with her rifle sight, looking for a clear shot. One wolf got too bold, leaping at the corral fence. Clara fired, and the wolf yelped and fell back. She'd grazed it, not a killing shot, but enough to hurt. The pack retreated slightly, reassessing. Clara fired 2 more warning shots, spacing them out, making it clear she wasn't going anywhere. The wolves paced and circled, frustrated by their protected prey. Clara could see the pack leader watching her with intelligent yellow eyes, calculating whether she was worth the fight. After what felt like hours, the wolves finally gave up and disappeared into the forest. Clara stood vigil until dawn, refusing to let down her guard, even though exhaustion made her vision blur and her hands shake. When the sun finally rose, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, Clara sank down onto an overturned bucket and allowed herself to cry. Not from fear or sadness, but from sheer relief that she'd made it through. The cattle were safe, the ranch was intact, she'd survived another day alone, but she'd also reached her limit. Her body was screaming for rest, her mind foggy with exhaustion. If the wolves came back tonight, she didn't know if she had the strength to defend the herd again. She needed Caleb to come home. She needed help. And hating herself for the weakness, Clara finally admitted what she'd been too proud to say before. She couldn't do this alone. Not indefinitely, not without breaking. The 4th day dawned clear and bitterly cold. Clara forced herself through the morning routine on sheer willpower, her body moving on autopilot while her mind felt disconnected and strange. She hadn't slept in over 36 hours. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow seemed to hold wolves. She was breaking ice at the water trough. Again, always again, an endless task that would continue until spring, when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders, moving fast. Clara's exhausted mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. The wolves had brought reinforcements. Margaret Hutchins was returning with the sheriff to forcibly install her nephew. Thieves had heard about the woman alone on the Ward Ranch and decided to help themselves. She grabbed her rifle and turned to face whatever was coming, too tired to be properly afraid anymore. The riders emerged from the trees, and Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief. Caleb was in the lead, his face grim and weathered, but alive and whole. Behind him rode Brennan and 3 other men from the hunting party, all of them looking exhausted but triumphant. Caleb dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, covering the distance to Clara in long strides. He grabbed her shoulders, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Are you all right? We saw the tracks, wolf tracks everywhere around the property. Did they attack?" "I'm fine. The cattle are fine. I drove off the pack twice." Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "They came the first time yesterday afternoon, then again last night. I moved the herd closer to the house, and—" She didn't get to finish because Caleb pulled her into a crushing embrace, his face buried in her hair. Clara felt him trembling, or maybe that was her, she couldn't tell anymore, and realized he'd been just as terrified as she had been. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough. "If those wolves had decided you were easier prey than the cattle, but they didn't. I made myself enough of a threat that they chose retreat over confrontation." Clara pulled back enough to look at him. "I did what needed to be done, Caleb, just like you taught me." Brennan had dismounted and was examining the fortified corral with grudging approval. "You did this alone? Moved the whole herd and built these defenses?" "I did. And drove off a wolf pack, twice. It wasn't a question this time." "I did." Brennan looked at Clara with an expression that might have been respect. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Ward. I said this was no place for a woman. I was wrong. You've got more grit than most men I know." Clara was too tired to properly savor the vindication. "Did you get the wolves? The pack that was killing livestock?" "We got them," Caleb said. "All 8. Tracked them into the high country and eliminated the threat." He paused. "But it looks like a splinter group broke off and came south. The tracks around here are fresh, probably the same wolves you dealt with." "They'll be back," one of the other hunters said. "Wolves don't give up that easy." "Then we'll track them tomorrow," Caleb said firmly. "But tonight, we rest. You men are welcome to sleep in the barn if you need shelter before heading home." The men accepted gratefully, clearly as exhausted as Caleb from days of hard riding and hunting. They moved to tend their horses, and finally, Caleb and Clara were alone. They stood facing each other in the snow, and Clara saw her own exhaustion reflected in Caleb's face. 4 days apart had aged them both. "I missed you," Caleb said quietly. "Every minute of every day, I missed you and worried about you and hated myself for leaving you alone." "I missed you too. And I was terrified and exhausted, and there were moments I didn't think I could handle it." Clara stepped closer, needing his warmth, his solidity. "But I did handle it, because you believed I could, because you trusted me with something that mattered to you. I'm sorry I had to go." "Don't be. You did what needed to be done, just like I did." She managed a tired smile. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? Both too stubborn to quit even when we probably should." Caleb kissed her then, deep and desperate and full of all the fear and relief and longing of their separation. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Come inside, Clara said. "You need food and rest, and I need to know you're really here and safe." They walked to the house together, Caleb's arm around Clara's shoulders, her body leaning into his support. Inside, the familiar space felt like sanctuary after the endless stress of the past days. Clara moved to make coffee while Caleb shed his heavy outdoor gear, both of them too tired for complex conversation, but needing to be in the same space, sharing the same air. "Margaret Hutchins came by," Clara said, her back to him as she worked at the stove. "Tried to install her nephew here to help me while you were gone." She heard Caleb go still. "What did you say?" "I told her no. Told her I didn't need or want Robert's supervision and sent them both away." Clara turned to face him. She wasn't happy about it. "I think I've made a real enemy there." "Good," Caleb said fiercely. "You don't need Margaret's approval or anyone else's. You proved that this week you're more than capable of handling this ranch and anything else the frontier throws at you. I'm not sure I want to prove it again quite so dramatically, Clara admitted. Those wolves, Caleb, they were smart, organized. If there had been more of them, if they'd attacked all at once. But they didn't. You survived. You protected the ranch. Caleb crossed to her, pulling her into his arms again. I'm so damn proud of you, Clara, and so grateful that you're all right. Clara buried her face in his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and wood smoke, and something essentially Caleb. I thought I could do this alone. I've been so determined to prove I don't need help, that I'm strong enough to handle anything. But these past 4 days, she paused, struggling with the admission. I realized I don't want to do it alone. I can, if I have to, but I don't want to. You don't have to. Caleb's arms tightened around her. We're partners, remember? We do this together. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other, letting the simple fact of their reunion sink in. Outside, the men were settling into the barn, their voices a low rumble in the distance. The cattle were safe in their reinforced corral. The wolves were a threat, but a manageable one now that Caleb was home. Eventually, Clara pulled back enough to look at Caleb's face. You need to eat and sleep. You look like you're about to fall over. So do you. Then we'll take care of each other. Clara managed a real smile. That's what partners do, right? That night, after Caleb had eaten and they'd both washed away the grime of their respective ordeals, they lay together in bed with the curtain gone and the pretense of separation abandoned completely. Caleb held Clara close, one hand stroking her hair, and she felt the last of the tension finally drain from her body. I learned something while you were gone, she said quietly into the darkness. What's that? That being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means knowing when to ask for help, when to admit you're scared, when to trust someone else to carry part of the burden. She shifted to look at him. I spent so long trying to prove I didn't need anyone. But the truth is, I need you, Caleb. Not because I'm weak, but because life is hard and having someone to face it with makes all the difference. Caleb's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I need you too. More than I knew how to say before I left. These 4 days made me realize that you're not just my wife or my partner on the ranch. He struggled for words, then gave up trying to be eloquent. You're everything, Clara. You're what makes this life worth living instead of just enduring. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind this time, born of emotion too big to contain. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Don't get used to it. I'm still not much for speeches. I don't need speeches. I just need you. She kissed him softly, a promise and a homecoming all at once. We're going to make this work, Caleb, this ranch, this life, this marriage. We're going to make all of it work. Yeah, Caleb agreed, pulling her closer. We are. Outside, the Montana winter pressed against the house with relentless cold. Somewhere in the darkness, wolves prowled and waited. The ranch still needed constant work to keep from falling apart. The town still whispered about the strange mail-order bride and her unconventional ways. But inside, 2 people who'd started as desperate strangers had found something neither expected, a partnership built on trust and respect, a growing love forged in the harsh crucible of frontier life, and the unshakable knowledge that together they could survive anything. The worst of winter was still ahead of them, but they'd already survived the hardest test, learning to trust each other completely, to depend on each other without shame, to build something real from the practical arrangement that had brought them together. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. And that made all the difference. Morning came too early, dragging Caleb from the first real sleep he'd had in days. For a moment, disoriented and still half in dreams, he forgot where he was. Then he felt Clara's warmth beside him, heard her steady breathing, and everything came rushing back. Home. He was home. He started to ease out of bed, trying not to wake her, but Clara's hand closed around his wrist. Don't, she murmured, eyes still closed. Stay. Just for a few more minutes. Caleb settled back down, pulling her close. Outside, he could hear the men stirring in the barn, preparing to leave. The cattle would need tending soon. The wolves were still out there, still a threat. But Clara was right. They could steal a few more minutes. We need to finish what we started yesterday, he said quietly. Track those wolves before they hit another ranch. I know. Clara's eyes opened, already alert despite her exhaustion. I'm coming with you this time. Clara, don't argue with me on this, Caleb. I've already fought those wolves twice. I know their patterns, where they approach from, how they hunt. You need that information, and I'm the only one who has it. Her voice was firm, brooking no disagreement. Besides, after what happened with Margaret Hutchins, I'd rather not be left alone again so soon. People might get the wrong idea about what I can and can't handle. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to keep her safe at home where wolves and winter couldn't touch her, but he could see the determination in her eyes, and he remembered his promise to himself, to see her as a true partner, not someone to be protected from every danger. All right, he said, but you stay close to me. No taking unnecessary risks. The same goes for you. They rose together, dressed in heavy layers, and emerged to find Brennan and the other men already saddling their horses. Brennan's eyebrows rose when he saw Clara in her riding gear, rifle slung across her back. Mrs. Ward is joining us? She is, Caleb said, his tone making it clear this wasn't up for debate. She's seen these wolves up close. She knows how they operate. Fair enough. Brennan actually looked impressed. We could use the help. These aren't ordinary wolves. They're too smart, too organized. Any insight is valuable. The other men, all local ranchers Caleb knew by name, if not well, nodded their agreement. Word of Clara's defense of the ranch had already spread, Caleb realized. These men might not have accepted her on the hunt before, but her actions had earned their respect. They rode out as the sun was cresting the horizon, following the wolf tracks that circled the ranch. Clara rode beside Caleb, pointing out where the pack had approached, where they'd tested the defenses, where they'd finally retreated. They're cautious, she said. The leader especially. He held back, let the younger wolves test first. When I shot at them, he made the decision to retreat immediately. He won't take unnecessary risks. Smart, one of the other men, a grizzled rancher named Cortez, observed, which makes them more dangerous, not less. They tracked the wolves north into the high country, following prints in the snow that were sometimes clear, sometimes obscured by wind and new snowfall. Clara proved invaluable, noticing details the men missed, a tuft of fur caught on a low branch, scratches on tree bark where wolves had marked territory, the pattern of their movement that suggested they were heading for a specific destination rather than wandering randomly. By midday, they'd tracked the pack to a narrow canyon with steep rock walls and limited exits. The wolves had denned up in a cave at the far end, clearly planning to wait out the cold before hunting again. Brennan studied the terrain with a tactical eye. We can't go in there. It's a perfect kill box. They'd have every advantage. So we wait them out, Caleb suggested. They'll have to come out eventually to hunt. That could take days, Cortez pointed out. And we don't have the supplies for a long siege. Clara had been quiet, studying the canyon walls with intense focus. Now she spoke up. There's another way. Look at the rock formation above the cave. It's unstable. Heavy snowpack, no support underneath. If we could trigger a controlled collapse, we could seal the cave entrance. Bury them alive? One of the younger men looked uncomfortable with the idea. They're wolves, not people, Brennan said bluntly. And they've killed livestock worth hundreds of dollars. We do what needs to be done. It's more humane than a prolonged hunt, Clara added quietly. Quick, certain, they won't suffer. The men debated briefly, but ultimately agreed. Clara's plan was the most efficient solution. The question was how to trigger the collapse without putting anyone in danger. Gunfire might do it, Caleb said, studying the precarious overhang. Concentrated shots at the weak points to destabilize the structure. They positioned themselves at safe distances and angles, then began firing in coordinated volleys at the base of the unstable rock formation. The sound echoed through the canyon, deafening in the enclosed space. For long moments, nothing happened except the thunder of rifle fire and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Then, with a crack like the world splitting open, the rock face gave way. Snow and stone cascaded down in a massive avalanche, tons of material sliding and tumbling with unstoppable momentum. The cave entrance disappeared beneath the debris, sealed completely. The wolves inside never had a chance to escape. It was over in seconds, final and absolute. The silence that followed felt heavy, weighted with the finality of what they'd done. Clara stared at the collapsed rock face, her expression unreadable. "You all right?" Caleb asked quietly. "I killed them," she said. "It was my plan, my idea. It was necessary. They would have kept killing, kept threatening our livelihood. You made a hard choice, but it was the right one." "I know, but knowing something is right doesn't always make it easy to live with." Clara turned away from the sealed cave. "Let's go home. I'm tired of death and cold and hard choices." The ride back was quieter, everyone processing what they'd done. When they reached the point where the group would split up, Brennan and the others heading to their own ranches, Caleb and Clara continuing home, Brennan pulled his horse alongside Clara's. "Mrs. Ward, I misjudged you. I thought you were just another Eastern woman playing at frontier life. I was wrong, and I apologize." Clara met his eyes steadily. "I appreciate that, Mr. Brennan, and I hope you'll remember this the next time you're tempted to judge someone's capabilities based on their gender rather than their actions." Brennan actually smiled, a rare expression on his weathered face. "I'll do that. You're welcome at my table any time, Mrs. Ward, both of you." It was a small thing, an invitation to dinner. But on the frontier, where social acceptance could mean the difference between isolation and community, it was significant. Brennan's public approval would carry weight in town, might even soften some of the disapproval Clara had faced. As they watched the men ride away, Clara leaned slightly in her saddle, and Caleb saw how exhausted she truly was. 5 days of constant stress and minimal sleep had taken their toll. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you home and into bed. You're dead on your feet." "I'm fine." "You're a terrible liar." But Caleb said it with affection. "Clara, you don't have to be strong every minute of every day, especially not with me." She looked at him, and something in her expression crumbled. "I'm so tired, Caleb, not just physically. I'm tired of fighting for every scrap of respect, tired of proving myself over and over, tired of being strong when what I really want is to just rest." "Then rest. You've earned it. You've more than earned it." Caleb moved his horse closer, reaching out to take her hand. "Let me take care of things for a while. Let me carry the weight." "Together," Clara said firmly. "We carry it together, but maybe I can lean a little more heavily on you for the next few days." "As long as you need." They made it home as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink that were almost painfully beautiful. The ranch looked peaceful in the fading light, the cattle secure in their corral, smoke rising from the chimney where the fire still burned from that morning. Caleb took care of the horses while Clara went inside to start dinner. When he joined her, he found her standing motionless at the stove, staring at the pot of water like she'd forgotten what she was supposed to do with it. "Sit," he ordered gently, guiding her to a chair. "I'll handle this." "You don't know how to cook." "I can heat up beans and salt pork. It's not fancy, but it's food." Caleb moved around the kitchen with more confidence than he felt. "Besides, it's time I learned. Can't have you doing all the work forever." He felt Clara watching him as he fumbled through the basics of meal preparation, and when he glanced over, she was smiling, a real, genuine smile that made her look younger and less burdened. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. I'm just happy." Despite everything, the wolves, the exhaustion, Margaret Hutchins and her disapproval, "I'm happy." She paused, as if surprised by her own words. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again. After Pennsylvania, after losing everyone, I thought happiness was something that happened to other people, not me." Caleb abandoned the cooking and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "You deserve to be happy, Clara. You deserve every good thing this life can offer." "So do you." She touched his face, her palm rough from work but infinitely gentle. "We both spent so long just surviving, we forgot what it felt like to actually live. Maybe that's what we do now. We stop just surviving and start living." They ate the simple meal together, and despite Caleb's lack of cooking skills, it tasted perfect because they were sharing it. Afterward, they sat by the fire, Clara's head on Caleb's shoulder, both too tired for conversation but needing the simple comfort of proximity. "I love you," Clara said suddenly, quietly, like the words had been building inside her and finally had to come out. I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other in the grand scheme of things, but I love you, Caleb Ward, and I needed you to know that. Caleb's heart felt too big for his chest. I love you too. Have for a while now, I think. Just didn't know how to say it. You just did. He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. What would you have done if I told you back in Pennsylvania that you'd end up on a failing Montana ranch, married to a man you'd never met, fighting wolves and winter storms and town gossip? I would have thought you were describing a nightmare, Clara said honestly. But it's not. It's hard and sometimes scary and definitely not what I imagined for my life. But it's real. And it's mine. Ours. Ours, Caleb agreed. That night they slept wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time since Clara had arrived, neither of them woke anxious or afraid. They were home, together, and that was enough. The next weeks brought a shift in the rhythm of ranch life. With the immediate wolf threat eliminated, Caleb and Clara could focus on preparing for the worst of winter. They worked side by side, falling into a partnership that felt effortless now that they'd stopped fighting their growing attachment to each other. Caleb taught Clara the intricacies of the ranch that she hadn't yet learned, how to predict weather by reading the sky, how to doctor sick cattle, how to maintain the tools and equipment that kept everything running. Clara taught Caleb the things she'd learned from her father, better ways to organize work, more efficient methods for daily tasks, the value of written records to track patterns and plan ahead. They learned each other too, in quieter ways. Caleb discovered that Clara sang while she worked, soft melodies from her childhood that made the hard labor feel lighter. Clara learned that Caleb was actually quite skilled at woodworking when he had time, and the simple repairs he'd been doing were just a fraction of what he could create when inspired. One evening, she found him in the barn working on something he'd hidden under a tarp when she approached. "What's that?" she asked. "Nothing, just a project." "Caleb Ward, you are a terrible liar." Clara pulled back the tarp before he could stop her, revealing a partially completed rocking chair, beautifully crafted with smooth lines and intricate detail in the armrests. "This is gorgeous. Why were you hiding it?" Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed. "It's for you. I wanted it to be finished before you saw it. Wanted it to be perfect." Clara ran her hands over the smooth wood, emotion thick in her throat. "No one's ever made anything for me before. Not like this. You deserve beautiful things, Clara. This ranch, this life. It's all hard edges and constant work. I wanted you to have something that was just nice. Something to sit in on the porch when the weather turns warm." She kissed him then, pouring all her gratitude and love into the contact. "Thank you. It's perfect already, even unfinished." "I'll have it done before spring," Caleb promised. Winter deepened, bringing storms that buried the ranch under snow and temperatures that made exposed skin freeze in minutes. But inside the small house, warmth grew. Caleb and Clara developed rituals. Morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, evening stories by the fire, the way they moved around each other in the cramped space like dancers who'd learned each other's steps. The town's attitude shifted too, slowly but noticeably. Brennan's public approval had carried weight, and when the other ranchers from the wolf hunt spoke favorably of Clara's tracking skills and sharp thinking, people began to see her differently. She wasn't the scandalous mail-order bride anymore. She was Caleb Ward's capable wife, a woman who'd proven herself when it mattered. Margaret Hutchins still disapproved, still whispered and glared when they came to town. But even her influence had limits, and increasingly other women started nodding to Clara in the street, striking up tentative conversations at the general store. Sarah Henry, the pastor's wife, who'd been among Clara's harshest critics, even approached her one day in late February with an unexpected request. "Mrs. Ward, I wonder if I might ask your advice." Clara looked up from the fabric she'd been examining, surprised. "Of course." "My daughter is engaged to be married, and she'll be moving to her husband's ranch come spring. I've been trying to prepare her, but—" Sarah paused, clearly struggling with the admission. "I don't know how to prepare her for the reality of frontier life. I've always lived in town, always had help and community. But she'll be isolated, responsible for things I never had to manage. And I fear I'm failing her by not knowing how to guide her properly." Clara understood what this admission cost Sarah. The woman who'd been so quick to judge Clara for not fitting conventional expectations was now asking for help from the very woman she'd criticized. "What does she know already?" Clara asked. "Basic household management, cooking, sewing, but nothing about livestock or outdoor work or how to handle a crisis when there's no one to help." "Send her to me," Clara said. "I'll teach her what I can. How to read weather signs, basic animal care, how to stay calm when things go wrong. It won't make her an expert, but it might give her confidence." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You would do that? After how I treated you? Frontier life is hard enough without women tearing each other down. If I can help your daughter be better prepared, I will." Clara paused. "Besides, I remember what it felt like to arrive here with more courage than knowledge. I don't want anyone else to struggle the way I did." Word of Clara's offer spread, and soon other young women began appearing at the ranch, daughters of ranchers and shopkeepers, all engaged or newly married, all desperate for practical knowledge their mothers couldn't provide. Clara found herself teaching impromptu classes, sharing everything she'd learned through trial and error. Caleb watched these gatherings with quiet pride. "You're becoming a pillar of the community," he observed one evening after the last student had left. "I'm becoming what I always wanted to be," Clara corrected. "Useful. Valued for what I can do rather than judged for what I'm not." "You're more than useful, Clara. You're essential." March arrived with the promise of spring still weeks away, but the worst of winter clearly behind them. The snow began to melt slowly, revealing the brown grass underneath. The cattle, having survived the harsh season, began to put on weight again. The ranch, which had seemed on the verge of failure when Clara first arrived, was not just surviving but showing signs of actual prosperity. One morning, Caleb returned from checking the herd with unusual excitement in his eyes. "What?" Clara asked, amused by his barely contained energy. 4 calves were born overnight, healthy, strong calves, and based on the timing, we should have at least a dozen more births in the next few weeks. Clara understood the significance immediately. Calves meant the herd was growing, meant income when they were sold, meant the ranch had a future beyond just scraping by. "We're going to make it," she said, wonderingly. "We're actually going to make it." "We are." Caleb pulled her into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "We're going to make it because of you. Because you refused to give up, because you learned and adapted and made this place better just by being here." "We made it because we worked together," Clara corrected when he set her down. "Because we stopped being 2 separate people trying to survive alone and became a team." That night they celebrated with a bottle of whiskey Caleb had been saving for a special occasion. They sat on the porch, still cold, but bearable now, with heavy blankets in each other's warmth, and watched the stars emerge in the clear sky. "I was thinking," Caleb said carefully, "when spring really arrives and the weather's better for travel, maybe we could take a trip, go to the city, get supplies, see something other than this ranch for a few days." Clara looked at him in surprise. "You hate leaving the ranch." "I do, but you've been here for months without a break, working harder than anyone should have to work. You deserve something nice. Maybe a real hotel, a real restaurant, actual civilization for a little while." "What I deserve," Clara said slowly, "is a partner who understands that I don't need fancy hotels or restaurants to be happy. I need exactly what I have, meaningful work, a place that's mine, and someone who sees me for who I really am." She leaned against his shoulder. "But a trip sounds nice anyway. Not to escape this life, but to remind ourselves what we're choosing by staying here." "Yeah," Caleb agreed, "exactly that." April brought rain instead of snow, cold and relentless, but undeniably spring rain. The brown grass began to green, and the cattle spread out from their winter shelters to graze on new growth. Clara planted a kitchen garden near the house, her hands in the soil reconnecting her to the farming roots of her childhood. The rocking chair Caleb had been building was finished and installed on the porch, its wood oiled to a warm shine. Clara sat in it every evening, watching the sunset and marveling at how much had changed since that cold October day when she'd stepped off the stagecoach. She'd been desperate then, running from a past she couldn't change, hoping for nothing more than survival and a place to belong. Now she had far more than she'd dared to hope for. A home, a purpose, a husband who loved her, not despite her strength, but because of it. One evening in late April, as they sat together on the porch, Caleb on the steps, Clara in her rocking chair, he asked her something that had been on his mind. "Do you ever regret it? Answering that advertisement? Coming here?" Clara thought about the question seriously, knowing Caleb deserved an honest answer. "I regret the circumstances that made it necessary. I regret losing my family, regret being forced to leave everything I knew. But regret coming here?" She reached down to take his hand. "Never. Not for a single moment. Even when it was hard, when you were fighting wolves alone or defending the ranch while I was gone, or dealing with Margaret Hutchins' disapproval. Especially then," Clara said firmly, "because those hard moments proved something important. They proved I'm strong enough to build the life I want instead of settling for whatever life happens to give me. They proved that I found a partner who trusts me to be capable instead of someone who needs me to be helpless. And they proved that sometimes the best things come from the most desperate choices." Caleb stood and moved to sit on the porch rail, facing her. "I placed that advertisement thinking I needed help. Someone to cook and clean and make the loneliness more bearable. I thought I was being practical. And instead you got me," Clara said with a slight smile. "Instead I got you," Caleb agreed. "And you were nothing like what I thought I needed. You challenged me, pushed me, refused to fit into any of my expectations. You made me work harder, think differently, see possibilities I'd given up on. Is there a point to this, or are you just feeling philosophical? The point is that you weren't what I needed. You were something far better. You were what I didn't know to want. A true partner, an equal, someone who makes every day better just by being in it." Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. "I bought you a ring when we went to town last month. Simple gold band, nothing fancy. I've been carrying it around trying to figure out the right moment to give it to you, but I realized there's no perfect moment. There's just now, and us, and me wanting you to have something that shows the world you belong here. With me." He held out the ring, and Clara felt tears pricking her eyes as she took it, studying the simple gold band that caught the fading sunlight. "We're already married," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know, but that was a practical arrangement made by two desperate people. This is different. This is me choosing you, not because I need help or because I'm lonely or because it makes practical sense. I choose you because I love you, because you've made my life infinitely better, because I can't imagine facing the future without you beside me." Clara slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how right it felt. "I choose you too, Caleb Ward. I choose this life, this ranch, every hard moment, and every beautiful one. I choose all of it." Caleb pulled her up from the rocking chair and into his arms, and they stood there on the porch as the sun set and the stars began to appear. Two people who'd started as strangers bound by necessity and had become something infinitely more precious: partners, lovers, best friends, home. The spring continued to unfold, bringing with it new challenges and new joys. The calves kept coming, healthy and strong. Clara's garden began to flourish. The ranch, once failing, now showed clear signs of prosperity and careful management. In May, they took their trip to the city. 3 days of relative luxury that felt both wonderful and strange after months of frontier simplicity. They bought supplies. Clara got fabric for new dresses, and Caleb purchased tools he'd been needing. But mostly, they walked the streets together, marveling at how different city life felt after becoming so accustomed to the isolation of the ranch. "Do you miss this?" Caleb asked as they sat in a restaurant, eating food someone else had prepared. "The civilization, the ease of it all?" Clara looked around at the crowded restaurant, the noise and bustle, the people who'd probably never known what it felt like to fight a blizzard or defend livestock from wolves. "I don't miss it at all. This is nice for a few days, but it's not home. Home is a drafty ranch house in Montana with a husband who makes terrible coffee and cattle that need constant attention and work that never ends." That's a strange definition of home. Maybe, but it's mine, ours. Clara reached across the table for his hand. "Let's finish this trip and go back where we belong." They returned to the ranch at the end of May to find everything exactly as they'd left it. The cattle thriving, the garden growing, the house waiting. As they rode up the path and the familiar buildings came into view, Clara felt a surge of emotion so strong it took her breath away. This was home. Not because it was easy or comfortable or anything she'd imagined for herself, but because it was where she'd found herself again after thinking that part of her had died with her family. Because it was where she'd learned that strength wasn't the same as being alone, that vulnerability could coexist with capability, that love could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. That summer brought its own challenges, a drought that required careful water management, a section of fence that needed complete replacement, the endless work of haying for the next winter. But Clara and Caleb faced it all together, their partnership now so natural that they often worked in silence, each knowing instinctively what the other needed. By the time autumn arrived again, a full year since Clara had stepped off that stagecoach, the ranch was transformed. The barn stood solid and true. The cattle were healthy and numerous. The house had been repaired and winterized. They'd built something real here, something that would last. On an October evening that echoed the cold clarity of the night they'd first met, Clara and Caleb sat together on the porch in the rocking chair he'd made, squeezed in together despite it being built for one person, and watched the sunset paint the Montana sky in impossible colors. "A year ago today," Clara said quietly, "I arrived here terrified and desperate, with no idea what I was getting into." "A year ago today," Caleb replied, "I was convinced I'd made the biggest mistake of my life by ordering a mail-order bride." "And now?" Caleb pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Now I know I made the best decision of my life. Everything good that's happened, everything we've built, every moment of happiness, it all started with that advertisement, with you being brave enough to answer it." Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here, the loss, the desperation, the leap of faith that had seemed like surrender, but was actually the beginning of everything. She thought about the woman she'd been when she arrived, so determined to prove she didn't need anyone, so convinced that being strong meant being alone. And she thought about the woman she'd become, still strong, still capable, but no longer afraid to need someone. No longer mistaking isolation for independence or vulnerability for weakness. "I was wrong about so many things," she said. "I thought I was coming here to survive, but I didn't come here to survive. I came here to live." "We both did," Caleb agreed, "and we're doing a damn good job of it." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way possible and had built something beautiful from desperation and necessity and growing love. The frontier stretched around them, vast and challenging and unforgiving as ever. But they'd learned its language. They'd proven themselves capable of meeting its demands, and they'd done it not by conquering the land or bending it to their will, but by adapting, by learning, by becoming the kind of people who could thrive in the harshness instead of merely enduring it. The Montana winter would come again, bringing its storms and cold and endless work. There would be more challenges, more hard choices, more moments when survival seemed uncertain. But Clara and Caleb would face it all together, partners in the truest sense. Their marriage no longer a practical arrangement, but a love story written in shared labor and mutual respect and the quiet certainty of belonging. What had started as a mistake, a desperate gamble by two lonely people with no better options, had become something neither could have imagined. Not perfect, never easy, but real and solid and worth every hardship. The frontier had tried to break them both. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger than either could have been alone. And in the process, it had given them exactly what they needed, even when they hadn't known to ask for it: each other. Home. A future built on the unshakable foundation of choosing to stand together against whatever came next. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of winter on its breath. And on the porch of a small ranch house in the Montana Territory, two people who'd started as strangers held each other close and faced the darkening sky without fear, because they'd already survived the storm. And they'd learned that together, they could survive anything.